Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dancing into Brain Health podcast. I am your host, Magda Kaczmarska. Much of the latest research on brain health and aging have emphasized the ability of our brains to be malleable and plastic across our life. The actions we take or do not take, our environments, both social and physical, as well as our biology, influence our brain health trajectories. Researchers highlight 14 modifiable risk factors that over a lifetime can decrease our risk of developing dementia by 45%. Our guest today, Dr. Helena Blumen, is a leader in the field of cognitive and motor aging, helping illuminate our understanding of ways these modifiable risk factors play out both in the structure and function of our brains. Dr. Blumen is a cognitive scientist with postgraduate training in cognitive and motor aging, magnetic resonance imaging, and clinical research methods. She is a professor and vice chair of research in the Department of Neurology at Stony Brook Medicine. The overall goal of Dr. Blumen's research is to optimize social, cognitive, physical, and brain functions in aging, pre-dementia, and Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. Her current research examines modifiable risk factors of brain, gait, and cognitive decline in aging and pre-dementia, including social connection, for example, social support, and social disconnection, for example, loneliness. The ultimate goal of this research is to develop efficacious lifestyle interventions like social dancing that can be used to improve cognitive and physical functions in aging and pre-dementia. Welcome, Dr. Blumen. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Thank you, Magda. That was a kind introduction.
It really is an honor to host you on this podcast. I'm very open about geeking out, but I have been following your work. I initially said 6 or 7 years, but I think it's been longer. And I personally attribute your work in gait and social dancing and cognitive aging as really placing dance on the map. Your work has helped bring a whole new avenue of interest in dance and health research onto the platform. So I thank you for your work, and I'm also super humbled to have this conversation with you. I also really deeply admire you as a researcher, as a person, not only in your leadership and from an academic stance, but I also follow you and see the work that you do in really uplifting and illuminating paths for women in the field of neuroscience. So I really admire you for that. And I'm so excited that we have a chance to talk today, that you were taking time out of your busy schedules to, actually, you were saying you're writing a grant. So thank you for taking time out of paving the path for more wonderful work to have this conversation, and for this opportunity for our listeners to have a chance to learn about some of your work up to this point and some of the work that's on the horizon. So in starting today's conversation, I have had a chance to talk with you, but I'd love for our listeners to have an understanding of some of your background and what drew you to this work. Would you be open to maybe giving us a little bit of an introduction and sharing what inspired you to have this interest in the fields of cognitive, motor, and social aging?
Sure, I'd love to. And I'm going to start with a personal anecdote, which I think had a profound influence on me. So my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease when she was just 65. And I was already a researcher at the time, but I think I found it really hard to accept that there was nothing we could do. Alzheimer's disease is a horrible disease. Anybody who's experienced it or has had a family member who has experienced it knows how horrendous it is. And it really is hard to accept. So I think even though I was in the cognitive aging area, I think I became much more focused on looking at potentially modifiable risk factors of Alzheimer's disease because of that. Because my mother had a lot of those risk factors. She was not very highly educated. She was a homemaker. She wasn't particularly physically active or socially active. So I think I think that made me kind of understand how important that is. And that is really what drew me into this modifiable risk factors of dementia. And I think more than anything, I think there's a lot of things that we know that we are not making use of. So we know that it's good to exercise. We know that it's good to socially engage people, particularly in old age. And we also know that it's good for us to exercise. Despite that, we don't always do what we're supposed to do. Even I, who think about this all the time. So it's really a challenge, I feel, not only to understand how it affects the brain, but also what we can do in order to intervene. And I think of those two areas of research as equally important, like understanding what is happening to the brain, as well as what we can do about it. So that's what brought me into here. And then, of course, I have a degree in cognitive psychology and did postdoctoral training and so on. But I think my personal experience with Alzheimer's disease is really what has made me stick with it.
Oh, thank you for sharing that story. And I'm sorry to hear that you've had to walk this journey, but I'm also grateful that you're bringing that and kind of navigating that passion into your work. And I wanted to highlight something that you said, which I think is really critical. How can we motivate people, right? Because I think it comes down to motivation, understanding these things, modifiable risk factors and the things that can help prevent disease is one thing, but then motivating people to take action on these things, which is where I think, studying and understanding some of these approaches and these interventions that maybe are like a spoonful of sugar, so to speak, right? To help make the medicine go down are really great. Your work kind of straddles a variety of modifiable risk factors, right? So and for those who are not familiar, there are 14, so we won't go into all of them, but some of the ones that are really have a high impact are physical activity, and social connection, and obviously education. But social activity and physical activity and social engagement are really high on the list. And your work has actually intervened and explores both of those. So I thought, in today's conversation, that maybe we could start with the motor domains first, because that is actually how I learned about you and your work, was the study of gait. And gait, I'm going to ask you to describe gait rather than me describing it. And I first learned about your work actually with your mentor, Dr. Verghese, and who you were studying gait as a prodromal, a very early indicator of cognitive change or potential brain health change, maybe not even cognitive change. And that has then led you into, as you've carried your work into some innovative territories around this motoric phenomenon, which is really hard to study, and this connection of the motor, which we perceive physically, and the brain. So I'm curious, how would you define gait, and how are the two connected? How are gait and brain health connected?
So gait refers to how we walk, and that can be measured in many different ways. We can measure how fast somebody's walking. We can measure how much time they spend on both feet. We'd call that double support time. And all of these, these are quantitative metrics of gait that we can use in order to try to understand how that changes with time. I was not the first one to look at gait, for sure. There was actually this Swedish researcher. I'm from Sweden too, so I have to plug her. Her name was Lundin Olsson, and she was one of the first to observe that when people right before they were likely to get dementia or have some sort of impairment, they started to not be able to walk while carrying on a conversation. So she observed this, I believe, in a hospital, and saw that that people who had to stop while they were walking, that was a sign of something that was going to happen later on. So that was the initial observation. Then my mentor, who I still work with today, Joe Verghese, came along and kind of put together this program of research, really showing that gait was an early marker of dementia, of gait abnormalities, of dementia. So that and I think the power of that was really that it could be measured so easily. So we do fancy things in the lab where we have a mat and we can see double support and we can quantify different things. But even timing somebody to walk down a hallway is enough. Just gait speed alone is a very good predictor of dementia. It also has been shown that the way that the speed at which we walk declines as we get older. It starts to kind of accelerate a little bit before we get these pre-dementia syndromes like mild cognitive impairment. So there's a lot of good evidence for that. And then when I first started studying gait, I was really interested in what the shared networks of walking and cognition was. So if this is an indicator of dementia or mild cognitive impairment, the brain networks that we use to walk should be similar to the ones that we use when we think or remember or navigate our environment cognitively. And so that's really what my early research did, was look at that. And throughout that process, I also, because of my mentor at the time, became interested in this motoric cognitive risk phenomenon or syndrome, which is has now been studied by a lot of other people, but it's really these people who are walking slower than would be expected of their age and sex, as well as have some sort of cognitive complaint. So they might notice themselves that they are not functioning as well as they used to, but they don't necessarily show any decline on cognitive tests. So that slow walking speed and the subjective cognitive concern, we call it, seems to be an even better predictor of dementia in the future. And this is both Alzheimer's disease as well as other forms of dementia like vascular dementia, which can be caused by stroke or cerebral small vessel disease. So we looked at that. We were some of the first to look at what the brain networks associated with that were. And again, we saw something very similar to walking alone, and we saw a lot of overlap between this syndrome, gait, as well as cognition. And we also showed that the brain patterns that we saw when we looked at gait correlated with how well people were doing on cognitive tests. So that's how I kind of came from being an aging person to a motor aging researcher. But I was always interested in social relationships and social engagement. So as a graduate student, I actually did my dissertation was a collaborative memory. So I wanted to, where I kind of looked, and this was just in young adults, but I looked at how people, when they collaborate with others, whether they did better on memory tests. And what we showed in essence was that, yes, they might lose something during the collaboration, that's collaborative inhibition, but later on they actually benefit from that collaboration. So individually they remember more information, so that there's both costs and benefits. So I always wanted to get back to that. So then I thought to myself, well, if social isolation and loneliness and these social connection measures also are associated with dementia, what do the brain systems or the brain substrates associated with these measures look like? And again, we saw something very similar. There are always differences, but the important thing, I think, is that there's more shared things than there are differences, and there's really some value to that. And I think that's also why I became interested in dancing.
Thank you for that plug. I love it. We totally planned this part. My geeky brain is totally, you've thrown so many kernels that I want to follow, and I'm really fighting to follow a structure. But I do want to actually come back and highlight a few things that you said, because they're really so cool. I mean, first of all, just To me, I'm really fascinated by this understanding that you were able to look at something that we look at motorically, right? So we think
Hmm.
about movement and movement coordination. And of course, we think about the fact that our brain supports it. But especially when I was first learning about the brain, we were told that our brains have different regions, almost like different neighborhoods, right? And so we have one
Hmm.
part of our brain that is a neighborhood for memory, and another part of our brain that gives us executive control and attention and focus, and another part of our brain that's for our vision, and another part of our brain where our movement is controlled. And maybe some of them kind of interact occasionally, but when I first was learning about the brain, that's how I understood things, right? So I know now that there's more conversation about pathways and circuits and networks, but I just think it's brilliant that you had that idea, and then that you obviously, all research happens collaboratively. We're all, but I do see you as somebody who's connected those two, and I think that's just incredible that we're able to look at something like the brain, which it's really hard to study. And especially, some of we live in a pretty wealthy country, but for most of the people in the world, access to some of the ways that we can look inside the brain, like the fMRI, are not financially accessible. So the fact that we can
Yeah.
look at something like movement and gait and see some changes and say, oh, we might want to intervene, to help diagnose very, very early changes, I think is really profound from an equity standpoint. But then also from the other thing that you said, which I think is super, super cool, is the collaborative memory. I had not known about this work of yours. I've never even heard about collaborative memory. Now you've seeded something for me. I mean, I do want to, maybe not today. We may not have time, but I'd love to come back to this conversation. I know you said you were doing this with youth, but the work that we do with people living with dementia at some of our programs, and also with older persons, is all collaborative. We're co-creating.
Hmm.
I anticipate that part of the way that this is so helpful for people who are living with a cognitive impairment, who are living with cognitive change, is that we can kind of rely on people's strengths, kind of supporting maybe other deficits, right? And so then collectively we're able to kind of amplify the strengths, and work towards a common goal. But we're also hearing some things that are speaking about some of these other benefits of belonging and social connection. So I think perhaps maybe it's a chicken or an egg situation, perhaps. So I'd love to come back to that. And then I also wanted to just highlight what you're saying, which I think is probably the main takeaway that I'd love for people to take from this, is that yes, we have these social networks, yeah, we have cognitive networks, we have motor
Hmm.
networks, motor activity networks in our brain. But even though they each are unique, they are more similar than they are dissimilar, is what I'm hearing you say. And that, I think, is a mind blown kind of emoji scenario right here. And I'm looking forward to hearing about some of the ways that you're learning about that. Um,
Just to add to that point, I think that is even more true as we get older.
mm,
So if you think of the way that we are walking in our early adult life, right? We walk without an issue, right?
yes.
We just walk, it's automatic. We talk on the phone, we text, we do all sorts of other multitasking things. But what happens as people get older is because the brain cannot manage that automatically anymore. So the brain systems that you rely on become more cognitive. So it's almost like
Mm,
you're switching from this automatic way of walking to this controlled way of walking, which requires more cognitive resources because your brain is not as healthy as it was in your 30s.
yeah. That makes sense. I think maybe anybody who's ever had a twisted ankle or has I had a pretty major injury when I was in graduate school, and I was non weight bearing on one foot for almost a year. And so I remember when I initially started walking again, I put a lot of my attentional focus on the process
Yes.
of walking. And I perceived that as being very exhausting, which probably meant I was using more of my cognitive abilities. So
Yeah.
that makes a lot of sense. So I'm tempted to go in two different directions, but I wonder if we can go into this connection of the social dancing really quickly. Because I know that that was some work that you have done. I know that it was cut short by COVID, but I did want to come to it, and if you're willing to speak about some of the things that you found. So one of the things that we know, and kind of the premise of your work, has been that lifelong social dancers have better gait than their non-dancing counterparts. But from if I'm recalling it correctly, what we know is that their physical strength isn't necessarily different. So I think that's really interesting from a practice-based standpoint. When I'm thinking about working with older persons and with dance, maybe introducing some resistance training in addition to their social dancing, so that we're kind of hitting all of those domains. And from what I understand, you've participated, or you actually have a randomized control trial where you were comparing social dance with treadmill walking among older persons at risk for dementia. But this RCT was cut short by COVID. And I'm wondering, I know that it was not ideal, but you still completed the study and had some preliminary work. Would you be willing to share a little bit about what you found, even though it was
Sure.
preliminary?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it is a small study. It was supposed to be a pilot study, and it became very much a pilot study because of COVID, because it just was hard for us to continue, obviously, during that time. Well, so what we wanted to do, and this is also in collaboration with Joe Verghese, we wanted to contrast aerobic exercise with social dancing for a couple of reasons. One is that it engaged all these different processes. It is a social activity to dance with someone else. It's a cognitive activity because you have to remember the steps. It's also a physically active activity or aerobic activity. So we thought that because of that, it might generate more benefits on cognition, particularly in this at-risk group of older adults that we studied. We thought, or there are other studies showing that aerobic exercise like treadmill walking or running or walking outside have some benefits on the brain and cognition. But we thought that social dancing would give more than that.
Mm.
So that's what we compared it to. And we also thought that maybe some people like treadmill walking. There are people who do that, and there might be people who have no problem motivating themselves to do that, but there are also people who are not. So maybe some people might benefit more from dancing just because it's a more enjoyable activity. And again, I'm biased when I say this, but I don't necessarily like walking on the treadmill. But I do it sometimes anyway because I know I have to. But yeah, so it was kind of twofold in the sense that we wanted to look at it because of the complexity of the different activities as well as motivation wise. And we had people either dance or walk on the treadmill twice a week for 90 minutes, which included some warm up, stretching, blood pressure monitoring, and all that we have to do in order to make sure that people are safe. And then we tested people prior to the intervention and after 6 months of that intervention. And what we found was that there were some benefits on one of our measures of executive function, which was the digit symbol substitution task. It wasn't an overall benefit on all the different tests that we had, but on this isolated task at least, it seemed like both people improved, but the dancers improved more.
Can you explain that test for us?
So when a digit symbol substitution task gives you a series of digits and symbols that you have to match. So you're asked to write down the digit that corresponds with the symbol. So it's like you're given a code and then you have to write it down, and then we measure how many items people are able to put down in a certain amount of time. And if you're able to do a lot, then we say that you're able to use your executive function, because you're going through this code and you're writing it down. You have to go up and down, and you have to keep this in mind. So it's somewhat challenging, but that's the task that we saw
Huh.
benefits on. And then we also looked at the brain. We looked at a bunch of different measures. We actually thought that our functional MRI measure would be the most sensitive, but it turned out,
Huh.
maybe because of pilot
Mm.
or a small sample size, I should say, we didn't see anything. But we did see that when we looked at hippocampal volume, the change in volume between pre and post was less among people that danced compared to those
Oh.
that walked on the treadmill. So there's some evidence, even if it's a small sample, that maybe dancing was contributing to this less hippocampal atrophy that we observed. And I think that's the most exciting part of the study,
Yeah.
I think, because the hippocampus is one of the regions that are affected by Alzheimer's disease very
Mm.
early on. And it's also a key region that is important for memory functions. But again, it's a small
Yeah.
sample. So we think it's encouraging. And I think that's also the state of the literature at
Yeah.
this point, is that there's been a fair bit of small trials
Yeah.
that seem to be beneficial, but we don't yet have a really good definitive trial of
Yeah.
contrasting social dancing with another type of exercise in particular, because I think if we contrast it with doing nothing, we can probably see that it's beneficial,
Yes.
but we want to kind of show that there's something special about dancing, and
Yeah.
that hasn't quite been shown yet. But hopefully the National Institute on Health will someday fund our
Yeah.
larger study. We'll see.
I think our conversation just prior to this is with Dr. Arlene Haas, who's also a global brain health fellow, but she's a researcher based in Brazil, and she works in dance and health. And
Mm-hmm.
we've collaborated on an umbrella review, actually. And so
Mm-hmm.
we spoke about that, where we're looking at the meta-analyses and the systematic reviews that have been done on this topic. And as you're saying, there's promising trends, but we need more research and we need more. Dance is also really complicated, right? So I think there's different, how we set up the intervention is also going to be really challenging. But one thing that I think I consider all the time is, when you're comparing less complex activity like treadmill walking, with, you even mentioned too, there's a complexity to dance. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's difficult to study a complex intervention, but it's actually that complexity that probably is, it's what's the winning juice, right? It's what makes it
Yeah.
special.
It's the emergent property of the activity itself. It just goes back to the idea that sometimes learning has to be effortful, right?
Yes.
so
Yes.
so what we do that's easy is not always what's best for us,
Yeah.
and dancing is like that. And But it's also, quite fun. It is a little frustrating, but it also is quite fun, and a
Yeah.
lot more fun than doing the same thing over and over
Yes.
again. And I think the social aspects of social dancing in particular, or what you're doing,
Mhm.
co-creating movement, is um,
Yeah. You said that the things that are difficult to learn are better. And I don't want to veer us too much off of this, but I do I I've learned from some of my mentors about how it's actually the challenge when we put ourselves into almost what I would call positive stress, something that pushes us a little bit outside of our comfort zone, that is actually really beneficial for our brain. So anyway, do want to come back to this conversation about social dance and social activity and social connection. And, you know, this understanding again of that triangulation of cognitive, social, and motor. So I think keeping that in mind. What are some of the things that you're finding, or, or what that you perceive as being some of these interconnections between social connection, gait, and cognition? Um, how are you looking at these connections in your research?
So some of the epidemiological research that we've done is showing that some of these social measures, whether it's um, social support,
Hmm.
which is, do you, so so there are kind of three ways that, or three categories of social connection measures. And this was developed by, I think, Holt Lundstad, who's done some meta-analysis on social connection. That there are structural measures, functional measures, and quality measures. So structural measures is things like, do you have somebody to help you, or do you live with somebody? Are you married? Do you have family members that you talk to? So that's kind of the structure of your social network, right? And that has different types of measures. And then you have the function of that social network. And that's things like social support, meaning, so I have this family member and these friends, but when I need help, I can actually call them and they will come and help me. So that is support. And loneliness is also, it's a little fuzzy, but I think of it mostly as a functional measure, because you might have a lot of friends, but you might still feel lonely,
Yes.
right? It can be related to structure, but it doesn't always match one to one.
Yeah.
And then you have the quality of social connection. So I might have a lot of friends and family. They are providing me a lot of support, but they may or may not provide me with positive support. So positive support is beneficial, but negative support and positive support. And there was a study, and I can't remember who published this, but some years ago, where they showed that positive support from friends and family reduces the risk for dementia, but negative support from friends and family increases the risk. So those are the different types of things, ways that we can measure social connection. And what we've done in the early epidemiological studies is looking at structural and functional measures. We haven't really looked at quality measures so much, but we've shown, for example, that living with someone and volunteering or working for pay in old age reduces cognitive decline, or the rate of cognitive decline. We've also shown, so that's kind of showing a relationship
Yeah.
between structural social connection measures and cognition. And then we've also used functional measures to show that the amount of perceived support that you have from your network is associated with gait decline. So if
Mm.
you have more support, then you have a slower rate of decline. And if you have less, then
Wow.
you have a faster rate of decline. And then we've gone to show that in the brain too, that these social connection measures are associated with brain regions that
Support gait.
might have traditionally been mostly attributed to cognition or motor functions, but they are involved in social measures as well.
I mean, that's fascinating. I am stunned to silence, actually. I want to ask, can you speak a little bit more deeply about that? And then I want to come back to some of these. I'm don't want to use the word quality because you said that's one of the measures, but I'm trying to think how to qualify function and some of the ways that you're speaking about it. But I do want to come back to that because I think unpacking that is going to be very relevant to some of the things that we're seeing anecdotally and also through some of our research that's more qualitative with people living with dementia. So I guess let's go first. I'd want to hear more about some of these brain networks. Can you
Oh,
unpack them
okay.
a little bit more? Even if at the risk of getting really technical, I just find that so fascinating that perceiving a lower amount or quality, I guess, lower amount of support,
Hmm.
social support, is actually associated with cognitive decline and gait decline. Can you speak a little bit more about those regions and what you're
Yeah.
that are affected?
S- so actually, one of the aspects of social support that we have found to be most strongly associated with cognition, physical functions, and the brain
Mm,
is this tangible support.
mhm,
So, tangible support is assessed with questions like, do you have somebody to take care of you if you get sick?
mm,
Do you have someone to take you to doctor's appointments? Do you have someone who can cook meals for you if you can't cook for yourself?
mhm.
Those are really basic social
Yeah,
needs. If you are an older adult and you don't have that, it's not a good thing.
yeah.
So I think that's why it's so strongly associated. Overall support we see sometimes, but things like having somebody to do fun with and things with might not be as important as,
Yes.
I need somebody to take me to my doctor's appointment because I can't do that by myself. So what we found is that these types of social support measures, whether it's tangible support or overall support, is associated with brain networks that include the hippocampus, which, as I alluded to earlier when I talked about the DEN study, is a memory region that is also affected by Alzheimer's disease. Maybe not the earliest region, but one of the earlier regions that are affected by Alzheimer's disease. The cingulate or the insula, which are
Mhm,
also cognitive regions, and also the amygdala. Amygdala is emotional,
mhm,
or it has both, gives our memories emotions
mhm,
in the sense that if they're positive, it gives us positive memories, but also it's very important for fear learning, learning how to respond to that as well.
mhm,
So that's what we have found in terms of, and also the medial prefrontal cortex,
mm,
should say. So the medial prefrontal cortex is or has been linked to a lot of different social measures or social cognition in general.
mhm. Yeah, I think I'm loving hearing this because there's a really fascinating study that looks at what I would say is a really fundamental aspect of all of our social interaction, but is actually something that we use in dance very often, and that's mirroring. So there's actually a
Mm,
study. I don't remember where the team is from, but the first author is Ellingson, and they were looking at mirroring in a chronic pain scenario. So
mhm,
between a patient and their doctor, and so they were looking at applying mirroring as a way of measuring these pro-social behaviors and empathy. And one of what they found is that people who are mirroring one another actually engage the prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal
mhm.
cortex, as well as the temporal parietal junction and the insula. So hearing you say this, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this is amazing. So we're reaffirming these social support networks in the brain. Coming back to what you're saying about these really, well, I would say basic, we were talking about these basic needs, these tangible supports, and thinking about the
Mhm.
fact that actually there are a lot of people who are aging alone or maybe
Mhm.
living in this situation, especially in our societies these days. Like I'm an immigrant, right? So my grandmother actually was living alone, and being figuring out care and support for her as she was getting older was really difficult. And
Mhm.
thankfully, we were able to find somebody who was able to deliver meals, somebody who was able to come in and support with her day-to-day care while maintaining her independence, which she really wanted. But this makes me think about some of these policy situations where actually your research is informing the importance of investing in some of this work. And I hope it's okay for me
Yes.
to say that, but
Yeah, no,
I
no,
think
no.
this is really
It's
vital,
okay.
right?
It's okay. And I think And I think these are not really difficult things to intervene with,
Yeah.
really. There are Meals on Wheels. There are
Yeah.
all sorts of initiatives that we know uh, are, they're coming from a place. And I think the key is to make that something that's available to everybody, where you don't necessarily have to make a big effort to have that
Yeah.
a kind of assistance, or having someone to. And I should say there are a lot of efforts out there, and I don't want to be critical of those that are out there, but I think the key is to kind of have that be something that's a given.
Yeah.
And that probably has to, is related to my upbringing, because I'm from Sweden, and all of these things that I'm talking about are very much easily accessible
Yeah.
in Sweden. So because of our social infrastructure in Sweden, it's a lot easier to get old, in that sense that there is support systems for you, and
Well, I think, yeah. Well, and I think in justifying some of this work, understanding that, social connection is not just, it's not something that we can take frivolously, right? That you're illuminating that there is a very direct correlation between having access to some of these basic needs and social support services that then translate
hmm
to cognitive outcomes, which if they we don't intervene and provide these supports, then we actually end up having more from a social cost that we then have to
yeah,
intervene.
yeah, and there
Yeah,
are higher healthcare costs because
exactly.
of that. So
Exactly.
yeah, it might not be obvious, but it is.
Yeah.
We know how much Alzheimer's disease costs.
Yeah.
It's a lot, and just reducing it by a few percent would really reduce the healthcare costs, both the direct and indirect healthcare costs,
Yeah.
because it's not only the fact that the person with the disease is using the healthcare systems, it's also the people that are taking care of them
Yes.
that are becoming stressed because there's not enough support for them.
Yeah.
And then also they get sick, and that costs. So it's kind of like the snowball
Yeah.
effect of not investing early
Yeah.
in people who are getting older.
Yeah.
And we're all getting older.
Yes. Yes. We're
We're
all
all getting
aging.
older, and
Yes.
more of us are getting older,
Yeah.
and we are not necessarily going to die until we're much older, when we've had a lot more
Yeah.
diseases. So it's a real challenge for sure.
Well, I think, this is where your research is really exciting and fun, because I think for the most part, we don't want to think about prevention as being sexy. But you are pointing well, actually painting a really beautiful map and then illuminating really the pathways of how prevention actually does support our long-term health. So I'm very excited by that. I wanted to come back to something that you said, and see if we can well, I just wanted to hear your insights on this. So you were speaking about how these social networks have multiple levels, right? You're clearly talking about, we just talked about these very tangible supports, but then there's also, you were talking about the quality, whether it's positive or negative. Not necessarily the size of the network, but the quality, as well as how directly they're offering that support when we need it. So all of these things inform our collective bubble of social support. And something
Yes.
that I'm curious if in your research you've also looked at how people who are experiencing this reciprocity of support find themselves having a sense of meaning and purpose. I think you mentioned briefly that one of your research studies has looked at volunteerism. So for people who volunteer and
hmm
work with communities of older persons, that they end up having these better outcomes. what I'm hearing when you say that is a sense of purpose or meaning, that we know that what we're contributing to others is actually having a direct benefit to them, and that extension of our activity and engaging in one another's lives actually helps give us a sense of purpose, and that's important somehow. I'm curious if you perceive that, or if you have heard that in some of the or in some of your research, or maybe if
Well,
you perceive
I
it.
have heard
Yeah.
that, and and I'm stalling now to think of the name of the book. There's a very famous book written by a psychiatrist shortly after World War II, who was in the concentration camps, and he developed this idea of meaning and purpose, but now I can't remember who it is. But yeah, I have never studied meaning or purpose, but it is something that I want to include as a measure in upcoming studies, because I do think it's important. I also, however, I think I've been more focused on the fact that if you are volunteering or working or living with somebody, you're probably going to be a little bit more physically active too.
Yes.
So the fact that you have somebody that you can go and do things with, or that you get out of the house a little bit more than sit by yourself. So there's that relationship between social activity and physical activity. And I don't think we have a good handle on that. We know both of them are correlated, but we don't know what happens first. We don't know if they influence each other. And if there's bidirectional relationships. So I think that's another and the grant I'm working on now is trying to put all of that together, these interrelationship between the brain, social activities, physical activities, and all that, and kind of getting a better understanding of what kind of makes us more or less resilient to cognitive decline in aging.
Yeah, thank you. And I really hope you do get this grant, because I'm very curious to hear about this. One of the things that, in our work that we see, and this is both with people who are living with dementia and with older persons who are not living with dementia, some of the things that we're hearing from participants is that this engaging with peers is actually is helping introduce an experience of reciprocity, which I think is it's a different way perhaps of being in social engagement, and that they use different words for it. So, but thinking about what we are choosing to call belonging, but it's this idea, they'll use words, for instance, like oneness, or we are a team, or that what was the thing that was most important to you was the connection with other people. So even though we were engaging in dance and we were expecting that we were going to hear that the primary thing that people were speaking about, that the outcome, the biggest thing that they perceived as most impactful in their lives was going to be the fact that they were physically active. That was not what we heard. What we heard was that the most important thing for them was these social benefits, no, I think it's important to point out that we were working with this particular group. We were working with people online. So they were physically not, isolated from each other. And so what they perceived as most impactful was that social connection, even though the primary thing that got us together was dancing. And it was co-creative dancing. So I think that was also something that they spoke about, was the fact that they were collaborating together on something. And so I'm curious to hear, and I know that your study on social dance was initially looking at, yes, the complexity, but looking at this correlation with aerobic activity and another motoric modality. Do you perceive yourself perhaps exploring some of these, both kind of qualitative as well as quantitative and functional networks of these cognitive and motoric and social engagements, potentially in a dance model? Is that something that you might consider down the line?
Yes, no, I do think so. And I think of all the studies that I've been involved in, this small social dancing study is the one I've gotten the most feedback from from the participants. So just like you said, oh, it wasn't, nobody asked me, oh, did my brain get better, or did I do better on my memory test? But what they did say was the fact that, you know what? Thank you so much. I have friends now. I feel like I have a group of friends now. And that to me was something that I wasn't really expecting or thinking about, or or but they really, so it was the fact that they went to a place, they did an activity together, they socialized enough twice a week that they felt comfortable to reach out to those people after the study. And I think I told you last time we spoke that I had this woman who called me sometime, I think it was last year, and said, when are you starting this program again, this dancing program? Because I'm coming. And I said, well, it, it was a limited study, and, there's a lot of costs involved, and we're trying to get a grant to support a larger study. And if so, I have your number. I can let you know. And she said, well, I'm going to write an email, and so she outlined how beneficial it was to her and how she loved it and how she made friends. It was the most fun she had. And that was a really rewarding experience as a researcher, because oftentimes we sit here in the lab and I type and I can think, oh, this is going to be beneficial. And I do interact with participants, but I don't really get that kind of feedback. And it has inspired me to think more about these types of outcomes, that maybe they are increasing their friend network. Maybe they do feel more supported. Maybe they have more positive interactions with their friends as opposed to their family. Because as we all know, it's very hard to be a supportive child and parent, and like at the same time. And that's usually in middle age, is when our parents are getting older and they are getting decline. And I also have now 3 kids, or 2 or 3 kids, that I also have to focus on. So I don't I can see that there might be tension, and I do think that's very common in families, that there is tension between, how are you going to support your parents? Are they going to be able to live by themselves? Do I have to put them in an assisted living facility? How often can I go see them? And and so I can see how these interactions might be positive, but can also be negative at times.
Yes.
And I don't think there's any shame in admitting that.
Yeah.
It just, that's life. We have a lot of, so I think that if dancing can be something that supports positive interaction and positive support, and a positive relationship with another person, then that is wonderful.
Yeah, it sounds like
It wasn't what I set out to
yeah.
study, but it was wonderful.
I thank you for saying that and sharing this anecdote. And to me, hearing you talk about, our familial connections and then these collegial connections that we might
Hmm.
make, whether those, I think it's a yes and, right? In theater and in dance, this is more theater and improvisational term, this yes and, right?
Hmm.
They can be additive. And maybe if one of them is a little bit less positive, the
Hmm.
other one can kind of balance it out. So then you end up having, an even, or essentially having the positive be winning out, if you're versus having to rely on just one or the other.
Yeah.
So this is one of those situations where having more probably isn't necessarily going to cause harm. Having more
Yeah.
social connection isn't going to necessarily going to cause harm. I love that you're saying this, and I hope that you can continue this avenue of, because I'm also hearing about what you're remembering and recalling what you were talking about earlier about the fact that we can turn to people when we need them. I'm thinking about my grandmother and how at the end of her life she was a very proud person, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
and I see that she is now passed, but I see that as being one of the things that was very central to her character, and what I admired about her and what the community admired about her is that she was really somebody that people turned to. And so in the end, it was some of these younger and closer friends. Those were the people more so than some of the family that ended up being really instrumental in her succeeding at being independent and having a quality of life that was up to her standard. And so from a personal anecdote, I see how that's really important, but I'm really grateful to you for shining an empirical light on this. I know we don't need to always have an empirical proof of things, but I think it's important, and I think it's really valuable to have this
Well,
empirical
we
understanding.
shouldn't assume
Yeah.
that something is beneficial
Mm.
if it hasn't been shown, and I think that's,
Yeah.
you know, that's the key. I also think there's certain danger into promising
Mm.
benefits that have not been empirically shown. I think there's a lot of things that feel good for us
Yeah.
that we think is going to be beneficial, but may not. And I think that's where we play a role in highlighting what is working, what is
Yes.
not working, and when does something work, in what people does it work. Because just because
Yeah.
eating, you know, kale every day has worked for one person doesn't mean,
Yes.
there's so many things. And
Yeah.
I think that's the other thing that brought me into dancing, was that we had some there's a whole slew of studies looking at cognitive interventions,
Mm.
because it's so intuitive to think that, okay, I have a problem with cognition, I should train my cognition. And what happened was that, yeah, and here we have a lot more than we have when it comes to social dancing, is that cognitive intervention are really not that beneficial.
Mm.
They might have to be introduced earlier, they might have to be longer than any of the studies, and when they do benefit us, it's very limited and not long lasting. And I think these types of multimodal interventions like social dancing, there's also another study called the finger
Yeah.
trial, which was this huge trial I'm sure you heard of,
Yeah.
from Finland, where they intervene with many different aspects of older adults' life, and that really did show some benefits. And I think that's how we have to think, is that the intuitive is sometimes it helps,
Yeah.
but it's not always enough to show. And I think it's important for us as researcher to make sure that we exhaust
Yeah.
every little thing we can in order to improve function in aging.
Well, this is why you are gold to society. This is why I'm immensely grateful to you. Really, I cannot thank you enough for doing this. And again, that you are part of a community. But for me, as somebody who works at this intersection, I work and practice, but I'm also engaged in research, and I come from a research background. As somebody who really deeply cares about the field of dance and health, of course, we will always continue. We've always danced. We'll always continue to dance.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I love that you mentioned fingers, because this finger study is one of excites me, because it is something that is talking very seriously about lifestyle interventions or
Mhm.
non-pharmacological interventions in conjunction to pharmacological interventions, which
Yeah.
we think about that might be easier, but actually maybe that isn't the only way that we can actually support. Maybe there's a yes and situation again. And so
Yeah.
I love that you are thinking about it in this way, and that we are able to add granularity and nuance and specificity to some of these things, and be able to say, well, this and this is helpful in this situation, but in this situation may actually not be helpful. And if we
Yeah.
don't do the research, we will never know that. And we may actually miss out on a really potentially beneficial, hugely beneficial opportunity, if we tweak it in a certain way. And so this research that you're doing is profoundly, profoundly instrumental, vitally important. And I thank you so much for doing it. And I hope that we have lots and lots and lots and lots more funding for you to continue doing it. I just have,
I keep trying.
I know. Thank you for it. And thank you to your
Thank you.
team. Thank you to your mentors. Thank you to, I know our last guest, Dr. Aline Haas, talks about the fact that nothing really impactful happens alone. All of this happens through a family tree of researchers and practitioners. So
Yes. Yes.
we always finish by asking our guests if they can share a personal experience of the impact of dance or the arts in their lives. And I know you shared this anecdote from your participant, but I'm wondering, is there an experience, either one that you have experienced or that you've witnessed, that has helped you feel this power of dance or the arts on health and well-being?
So, I learned to dance in middle school.
Yes.
And no, so I was fortunate, and I should say this, and I feel like maybe I should go back to Sweden and look her up if she's still alive. But her name was Gun Carlson, and she was my middle school teacher. And she and her husband, I believe, were swing dancers. So they did swing dancing. And we just, she just incorporated that into our classes. And I don't think I would have sought out to dance myself, but because of her, I just learned. And then, and then I took, so I don't think I ever became crazy about dancing, like, oh, this is what I want to
Yeah.
devote my life. But because of her, I am always comfortable foolishly looking and trying to dance in different situations. So I think that's the personal anecdote I like to have. And I do remember my swing steps quite well. I still know how to do that. And then I learned other things as well, like the traditional Swedish folk dances. Some of them I could probably do, but in any case, that was just something that I got from her. And when I now study dancing, I can kind of understand it, or I can understand what is involved because I learned to do these dances, even if it was early on. And I kind of understand the process of learning how to dance. So although I'm not a dancer like you, or as involved in that, I have her to thank for that.
Gosh, thank you. And what is her name again?
Gun Carlson.
Gun Carlson. Well, thank you to Gun Carlson. And you've articulated also why I think it's so important that we include dance and the arts in schools.
Mhm.
Because
Mhm.
um, something planted a seed, and now we have somebody who is a brilliant neuroscientist who also has an understanding and an appreciation of dance. And I would say you
Yes.
are a dancer. I think all of us are dancers. We just have, not all of us have to be professional level.
No.
But thanks to Miss Goon Carlson, we can thank her for planting a seed. Now we have all of this phenomenal work, and not just at dance, but all of these other networks of social connection, motor activity, cognition in the brain. And thanks to her, and thank you to you. Um, as we're close today, I just wanted to ask if there's any other thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners today.
No, just stay socially, cognitively, physically engaged. I guess that's the only message I have.
That's a great one. We have to find a good way to send that out to the universe. But yes.
Yeah,
So
find a social, cognitive, and physical activity that you enjoy
yes.
and keep doing it and keep trying new things. I guess that's the message.
That's a very good message. Thank you. Oh my gosh, thank you, Dr. Blumen. I
Thank you, Magda.
so love your work, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
This episode of Dancing into Brain Health was edited and produced by me, Magda Kaczmarska, and Hilary Brown Estrafi. The music for this show is the title cut from the album Critical Path by Joe Venegoni and Carl Weingarten. Show notes, links, and resources from today's episode can be found on the Dancing into Brain Health page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.